In 1980, China's total manufacturing output was roughly 3% of the world's total. Today, it's closer to 30%. Nearly 1 in every manufactured goods on this planet was made in China. Your phone, your sneakers, the frame around your TV, the tiny screws inside your laptop. Made in China. And here's the part nobody talks about at dinner. It didn't happen by accident. It didn't happen because Chinese workers are uniquely hardworking. They are, but that's not the answer. It didn't happen because China got lucky. It happened because of a series of very deliberate decisions. By China, yes, but also by the United States, by global corporations, and by a post-war economic order that was essentially designed to make this outcome inevitable. This is how the world's factory got built, and why dismantling it is proving to be much harder than anyone expected. You've probably heard the phrase supply chain more in the last 5 years than in the previous 20. COVID shut down factories. Ships piled up outside ports. Baby formula disappeared from shelves. Semiconductors became a geopolitical weapon. Suddenly, everyone had the same question. How did we become this dependent on one country for so much of what we need? The honest answer is, slowly, then all at once. And to understand it, you have to go back to a country that in 1978 had an economy roughly the size of Belgium's. Belgium, one of the smallest economies in Europe. That was China. What happened next is one of the most consequential economic transformations in human history. And it started with a single sentence from a man who chain-smoked and played bridge. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping took control of the Chinese Communist Party, and he said something that for a communist leader was genuinely shocking. To get rich is glorious. He didn't mean everyone, not yet, but he meant something very specific. China needed foreign investment, foreign technology, and foreign markets. And to get them, it had to open up. So Deng created what he called special economic zones. 4 of them, initially. Small geographic areas, Shenzhen being the most famous, where foreign companies could operate under different rules. Lower taxes, fewer regulations, cheap, abundant labor. In 1980, Shenzhen was a fishing village of about 30,000 people. By 2000, it had 7 million. Today, it has 18 million, and it produces more electronics than most countries. But here's what made this different from every other developing country trying to attract foreign investment. China wasn't just offering cheap labor. It was offering a deal. Here's how the deal worked. You want access to our market? 1.4 billion consumers? You want to sell here? Then manufacture here. Transfer your technology. Train our workers. Build your factory on our soil. And in exchange, you get access to the largest consumer market on Earth. For Western CEOs sitting in quarterly earnings meetings, this was almost impossible to refuse. Labor costs in China in the 1990s were roughly 3% of labor costs in the United States. 3%. You could manufacture the same product for a fraction of the cost, then sell it back home at a slightly lower price and pocket the difference as pure margin. Every company that did it gained a competitive advantage over every company that didn't, which meant eventually every company did it. Nike, Apple, General Electric, Walmart, Ford. And once the factories were built, something else happened that nobody fully anticipated. The ecosystem formed.
This is the part that doesn't get talked about enough. Manufacturing isn't just about having factories. It's about having everything around the factories. The suppliers who make the components. The engineers who troubleshoot the machines. The logistics networks that move materials from point A to point B overnight. The workers who can shift from making one product to another in 72 hours. China built all of it at massive scale over decades. Want to make a smartphone? In Shenzhen, every single component, The screen, the battery, the camera module, the logic board, the casing is available within a 50-mile radius. There are suppliers for your suppliers, suppliers for their suppliers. A startup founder once described it this way: in Silicon Valley, you have a great idea on Monday. You might have a prototype by Friday. In Shenzhen, you have a great idea on Monday. You have a prototype by Wednesday afternoon. That's not marketing. That's geography. That's infrastructure. That's 40 years of deliberate industrial policy. And it's the reason that when Apple briefly considered moving iPhone production to the United States, Tim Cook gave a very specific answer as to why it wasn't possible. It's not just about labor costs. It's that the United States no longer has enough tooling engineers. Not enough tooling engineers, the people who build the machines that build the products. America had them once. It doesn't have them in sufficient numbers anymore, because for 3 decades there was no reason to train them. China was doing it. Now here's where the narrative gets complicated, because when you ask who benefited from this arrangement, the answer depends entirely on when you stop the clock. American consumers? Absolutely. For 30 years, the price of manufactured goods fell. Televisions that cost $2,000 in the 1980s cost $300 by 2005. Clothing got cheaper. Electronics got cheaper. Almost everything that could be manufactured got cheaper. This is sometimes called the China price. It's the reason Walmart could sell a DVD player for $29 in 2003. It's also the reason economists calculate that offshoring to China saved the average American household somewhere between $850 and $1,500 a year in lower prices. Chinese workers? Also yes, eventually. Wages in Chinese manufacturing grew roughly 15% per year for much of the 2000s. Hundreds of millions of people moved from rural poverty into something approaching a middle class. The World Bank calls it the fastest large-scale reduction in poverty in human history. Corporate shareholders? Enormously. Profit margins expanded. Stock prices went up. Executive compensation followed. American manufacturing workers? Economists David Autor, David Dorn, and Gordon Hanson published a paper in 2013 that has been cited more times than almost any other economics paper of the last 2 decades. It calculated that between 1999 and 2011, competition from China was responsible for the elimination of approximately 2 to 2.4 million American jobs. Not automated away, not made obsolete by technology, specifically moved to China. And the jobs that replaced them in services, in logistics, in retail, paid less, offered fewer benefits, provided less stability. So the math was not evenly distributed. The gains were diffuse, spread across 330 million consumers as slightly lower prices. The losses were concentrated, hitting specific towns, specific workers, specific communities with the kind of economic force that doesn't show up in the aggregate GDP numbers, but absolutely shows up in opioid mortality rates. In December 1991, China joined the World Trade Organization. At the time, the prevailing theory, genuinely believed by serious economists and policymakers on both sides of the political aisle, was that trade integration would make China more democratic, that economic liberalization would lead to political liberalization, that the rising Chinese middle class would demand Western-style freedoms. You can judge for yourself how that turned out. What WTO membership actually did was give China permanent normal trade relations with every major economy on Earth. Overnight, Chinese goods could enter the American market with the same low tariffs as goods from any other trading partner. The floodgates opened. Between 2001 and 2010, China's share of global manufacturing exports doubled, then doubled again. Factories that had survived the 1990s, that had managed to stay competitive, suddenly couldn't because the playing field had changed in a single signature. Here's the quiet absurdity buried in all of this.
The United States lobbied aggressively for China's WTO membership. American corporations were among the strongest advocates because they wanted legal certainty for the factories they were already building there. The country effectively lobbied for the conditions that would accelerate the hollowing out of its own industrial base. Nobody said capitalism was emotionally coherent. Now, cheap labor explains the beginning, but it doesn't explain why China maintained its manufacturing dominance even as wages rose. Because they did rise. By 2020, the average Chinese manufacturing wage was roughly 5 times what it was in 2000. Still lower than the United States, but no longer the dramatic differential that started everything. So why didn't manufacturing just shift to Vietnam or Bangladesh or Mexico? Some of it did, and that's worth acknowledging. Apparel and basic assembly did migrate to lower-cost countries. But the higher-value stuff, electronics, machinery, automotive components, largely stayed in China because of 3 things that rarely get mentioned in the news cycle. First, infrastructure. China spent the equivalent of trillions of dollars building the world's most modern manufacturing infrastructure: ports, rail, roads, power grids, factories that are in many cases more technologically advanced than anything in Europe or the United States. Second, state financing. Chinese manufacturers could borrow money from state-owned banks at rates that private companies in market economies simply cannot access. If a factory needed to upgrade its machinery, the cost of capital was not a constraint in the way it would be for an American competitor. Third, the currency. For most of the 2000s, China managed its exchange rate in a way that kept Chinese exports cheaper on global markets than they would have been under a freely floating currency. The U.S. Treasury and IMF complained about this for years. The practice has moderated more recently, but during the critical decades when the manufacturing base was being built, it provided a quiet, persistent advantage. Add those 3 things together, and you get not just cheap labor, but a structural advantage that compound interested itself for 30 years. So now we get to the present moment, and this is where the gap between the official narrative and the actual data becomes almost comical. Since roughly 2018, the story in political and business media is decoupling, reshoring, friendshoring, America bringing manufacturing home, supply chains being rewired away from China. And if you look at the announcements, the ribbon cuttings, the press releases, the political speeches about semiconductor fabs and electric vehicle plants, it sounds like a revolution is underway. Then you look at the trade data. In 2022, the United States imported more goods from China than in any previous year in history. More than ever. After 4 years of tariffs, after COVID, after all the decoupling rhetoric. Now, the composition is shifting slightly. The U.S. imports less in certain electronics categories, more in pharmaceuticals, chemicals, industrial machinery. But the aggregate dependency barely moved. There's a reason for this that sounds simple, but has enormous implications. You cannot reshore a supply chain by passing a law. You cannot rebuild 40 years of industrial ecosystem with a tax credit. The CHIPS Act is investing $52 billion in semiconductor manufacturing in the United States. That sounds enormous until you realize that TSMC, a single company in Taiwan, invests more than that every 18 months. Foxconn, which assembles iPhones in China, employs more than 700,000 people in a single complex. The largest single factory in the United States maybe employs 30,000. The scale is not even in the same dimension. Here's what's actually changing, and it matters more than the trade numbers. The world is splitting into 2 technological spheres of influence, not 2 trade blocks, 2 entire ecosystems. One built around American technology, semiconductors, software, AI infrastructure. The other built around Chinese technology, telecommunications, clean energy components, manufacturing machinery. The most advanced semiconductors in the world, the chips that power AI, that go into the most sophisticated military systems, are still designed by American companies and manufactured in Taiwan. China, for all its industrial might, has not yet cracked the very leading edge of semiconductor fabrication. This is the single biggest strategic vulnerability in the Chinese industrial model, and Beijing knows it, which is why the government